How's it going, everyone? We're doing another review data analysis, and this time we are looking at the Diablo video game franchise. So for those unfamiliar with it, this is a franchise that revolutionized the video game industry. It started in the mid-90s and it created an entirely new genre of video games called action role-playing games, or RPGs, action role-playing games. So the premise of the game is that the player controls a hero that moves around in real time. They go on an adventure, which is a horror story with religious elements. Essentially, they're fighting demons to try to stop hell from spreading on Earth. And there's symbolic philosophical elements to the story. And as the hero defeats monsters, they gain points called experience points. And once they reach enough points, the hero does what's called leveling up. And here's what that is. There are equations in the game that govern how good the hero is at different aspects of fighting. Okay, there could be an equation determining what the probability of a player landing a hit is when they try to hit a monster. What's the probability of them hitting? There's an equation for how much damage they deal, an equation for how many spells they can cast of a certain type before they run out of energy, an equation for how much damage a player can receive before their character dies and effectively they lose the game. And the equations may be different depending on whether the player does a melee attack or a ranged attack. There's also different classes of heroes that one can play as. For example, you could play as a warrior, as a rogue, as a sorcerer, and these different classes are different characters in the story. They look different, but the equations are also different. So for example, for the warrior, the equations are more optimal for melee fighting, and for the sorcerer, they're more optimal for using magic. And so because when you level up, what happens is you can actually increase some of the parameters in the equations of your choice. Okay, so I might play and increase parameters that make my character really good at dodging and have really good accuracy, whereas you might choose to increase parameters that make your player not as good at dodging, not have as good accuracy, but they're really tough, so they can take a lot of damage and they deal a lot of damage when they do hit. So as the game progresses, you're actually training your character to be a unique kind of fighter that you want them to be, right? So two players can play as the same class but end up with very different play experiences. So and then as they're going through the story, the game, they're defeating monsters, gaining these points, increasing their character attributes, right, through leveling up. They're also finding items like weapons, armor, and all that also affect these equations. And this makes them more effective warriors. So then they can fight tougher monsters, and they get even more points and even better items, and then they become even better warriors and fight even tougher monsters, and so on. The game and the story progresses. So I'm going to go through the Diablo releases chronologically, and we'll look at the review data for each of those releases. So here on the vertical axis, we have the audience rating out of 10. And on the horizontal axis, we have the critics score out of 100. And this data is taken from Metacritic. And of course, Diablo 4 was recently released. That's why we're even doing this video. And so the review data for Diablo 4 might change slightly since the release of this video. So just keep that in mind. And yeah, so before I start going through things chronologically, I just want to take a look at this big picture here. Okay, if I were to just show you this data and I were to say, hey, you know, here's this two-dimensional space. The higher a dot is, the better the audience received it. The more to the right a dot is, the better the critics received it. And all these dots represent certain products that were released. And I were to ask you, what can you tell me? What categories can you place these dots in? And you have no idea what these dots represent, that it's Diablo, that it's a video game. You don't know anything about that. Just here's the axis and here's the dots. Well, right away you can say, okay, well, there's these three that are really well received by everybody, right? So that's kind of one category right there. And there's this other one here at the very bottom that seems like really far from everything else. It seems like it doesn't even belong on the table. Like it's from a totally different ball game, right? And then everything else is somewhere kind of in the middle here, right? And you'd be absolutely right, okay? And it's interesting. You could see this just from the data without knowing any of the details, because these three here, these are actually the first two releases of Diablo, right? So you have Diablo, the original game, is this dot right here with a 94% critics rating, 8.6 audience rating. And then these two here, this is Diablo 2, and just above it is Diablo 2 Lord of Destruction. So this is an expansion to Diablo 2. Story-wise, it's Act 5 of the story. The original release was Acts 1 through 4, and then the expansion is Act 5. And it added some extra features and 2 more classes. And they were made by the same team. So the original visionary of the game, the original team that created Diablo 1, they also created Diablo 2 and the expansion, and that's it. They did not create any more Diablo games. Every other dot you see here was created by different people, a different team, not the original visionary, not the original team. So yeah, they are in a different category. That's expected. This one at the bottom here, this was a game that was actually made for mobile phones, not for the PC. This data, by the way, to control for the factor of what system it's played on, this is all PC data. Okay, so some of these, if not all of these, were released for consoles as well. But the games were originally created for PC. This is all PC data. But Diablo Immortal, that's this one at the bottom here, was actually originally created for mobile phones, and then a PC version was created as well, maybe because of backlash. So it was a pretty controversial game to release, and you can see the reviews show that it's far behind everything else by both critics and audience opinions. The other thing that's interesting is for most of these dots, the critics view it as pretty much the same. Okay, somewhere in the 80s, mid to high 80s. Whereas the audience view these releases very, very differently. And that's interesting to see. And I think I have an interesting theory as to why. So let's go through these chronologically and see. So the original Diablo is released, and it's a huge hit, very large cult following. It's released in the mid-90s, and at that time, there weren't really video game commercials so much for computer games. The internet, social media was not a thing that was used to spread information about video games. Social media didn't even exist. A popularity of computer games spread through word of mouth. So for something to receive a huge cult following in those times, that's very impressive. And again, it just created an entirely new genre. So it was very popular in terms of what popular meant for a computer game at that time. And then later on, Diablo 2 was released. Okay, now by this point, the internet was much more widespread, and it just became a global phenomenon. And by many rankings, Diablo 2 is considered the best computer game, the best video game ever made. There's a lot of views like that. Now, you could debate what's better, Diablo 2. They are made by the same team, like I said. So these were just like rock stars, massive hits, revolutionizing the industry. In Diablo 2, you had even more customization of your character. So not only can you change the parameters in those equations I was talking about that affect what kind of fighter you have, but also every class, which again, class means a different set of equations optimized for different fighting styles. Every class had access to 30 unique abilities. Now, ability might be you can heal yourself or your allies, or it could be some magic spell or special type of attack move. And so you have access to 30 abilities, or potential access to 30 abilities, and when you level up, you choose what ability to put points into. Okay, you have to put at least 1 point into an ability to use it, And then the more points you put into that ability, the more advanced that ability is. You're effectively training your character to do that particular thing. So realistically, you're not going to use all 30. You'll use maybe like 4 or 5 of them. So how many possibilities do you have there? Which 4 or 5 do you specialize in out of 30? 30 choose 5 or 30 choose 4. That's a huge number. And then you multiply that by 7 because you had 7 classes. So the game effectively has infinite replayability. Every player practically is going to have their own unique way of playing the game, their own unique way of training their warrior. So very popular games, okay? And then later on, Diablo 3 is released, okay? The original release of Diablo 3 is down here, okay? Big difference, okay? So the first two, we have scores high 80s, mid 90s according to the critics. The audience score it as well, mid 80s to low 90s, very high scores. And then Diablo 3 comes out. The critics consider it about the same, okay, high 80s, but the audience way lower, 4.2. Okay, so what happened? What's going on with Diablo 3? Well, a few things are going on. Okay, first off, the original team that created Diablos 1 and 2, they're not creating this game. Okay, it's the same company, it's the same intellectual property, but it's different people making it. Okay, and in fact, none of the dots come even close to the first 2 games. Now, this is interesting. Okay, this is interesting because it's empirical evidence that argues in favor of one particular direction in terms of what's more important for the quality of a work of entertainment. Is it the intellectual property, or is it the individuals creating it? Okay, and this is a discussion that happens a lot. Like, what happens to Marvel when Stan Lee isn't there anymore? What happens to Star Wars when George Lucas isn't working on it anymore, right? If you have the intellectual property that has this grand past, but different people are working on it, can you expect the same quality, right? And what we see here is that the company Blizzard, they maintain the intellectual property, but they're never able to create something with as high rankings, right? So that could be part of it. It's not the original visionaries, right? Not the original team working on it, but there could be other things at play. So part of it is the product itself, okay? So how is it made differently? So this customization that I was talking about, changing parameters in equations, which skills you specialize in, choosing that just doesn't exist in Diablo 3. Okay, when you level up, you gain access to predetermined abilities. The parameters in the equations just automatically increase by predetermined amounts depending on what class you're playing. You don't get to choose that. You still get to choose which of those available abilities you use, but you don't get to pick what becomes accessible to you, which ability you make stronger by putting more points into it. So that kind of customization is gone. If you and I play the same class, then our 2 warriors have the exact same abilities available to them. There's no customization like that. There's, the treasure hunting aspect still there. We might have different items that could affect those equations in different ways, but that kind of training, customization, it wasn't in the game anymore. That made a big difference. That's essentially a different kind of game. The artwork was also different. The art style was more cartoonish, not completely cartoonish. It was still a horror story. But there were people who had issues with the artwork. There were people who had issues with the storytelling style. Again, some people felt it was more cartoonish, where the bad guys are shown much more. They're not as mysterious as they are in the first 2 installments of the game. So there were a number of complaints there. And then the expansion pack came out, Diablo 3, the first expansion, Reaper of Souls. And that one was actually ranked much better by audience. That came to a 6.6. Again, critics still view it somewhere in the high 80s. So much better, but still not as good as the first 2 installments of the game. Now, it's important to note that people still consider Diablo 3 a very good, fun game. If you talk to people, they would say, oh, it's a great, fun game. It's just not nearly as good as the first 2. Okay, so again, you're comparing it to those first two, and that comparison may drive people's scores down. And another thing that could drive people's scores for Diablo 3 down is age. So the Diablo fan base that were teenager-ish, plus or minus a few years for the first two installments of the game, they're now older once Diablo 3 comes out. And so they've seen more, they're more experienced, they have other forms of, other ways to enjoy their time. They are more picky. They are harsher critics. They are more difficult to impress. Okay, so they might rank the exact same kind of product as lower. Okay, that's just, like older people tend to not be into video games as much as younger people. So that's another factor that may drive Diablo 3 scores down, because the people playing it will have a population that's overrepresented, where those who played the original two Diablo games are overrepresented compared to who's playing other video games when you look at who's playing Diablo 3. And so that age factor will also drive scores down. Now, you had another expansion to Diablo 3, Rise of the Necromancer, which added another class. It didn't add too much, not like the first expansion, so it's understandable why the critics would rank it a little bit lower and the audience rank it a little bit lower as well. But in general, you see this triangle, these three blue dots representing Diablo 3, and you can kind of see around where it is, like a 80, mid 80s ish, mid to high 80s according to critics, and just over 5, right, somewhere between 4.2 and 6.6, right, so 5 point something ish around there, out of 10 according to the audience. Now things get a little bit funny. Okay, funny or sad, comedy or tragedy. People are anticipating for years the announcement that Blizzard is working on Diablo 4. And then on a big industry event, they announce that their new product is a mobile Diablo game called Diablo Immortal. And you could YouTube that announcement, look at the videos, how they're announcing it, and people are disappointed. They think it's some sort of early April Fool's joke. It's a completely different experience, right? Seeing something on a big screen versus on a mobile phone. So people were very unhappy about that, especially because they were expecting Diablo 4. Once Diablo Immortal is eventually released, it's a mobile phone game. There's a lot of microtransactions. There's all the controversy that comes with mobile phone games, like it's a casino for children, that sort of thing. And of course, it's a different experience because it's a small screen on a phone. They did create a PC version as well, but even the PC version, it's clear it was meant for mobile phones. You still have your microtransactions. And again, there's no customization of your character. Just like in Diablo 3, you don't get to increase the parameters of the equations of your choice. You don't get to put more points into skills to specialize in. So that you can see was ranked much lower by both audience and critics. Looks like it doesn't even belong on the chart. People kind of pretend that it doesn't exist. So then something interesting happens. This big hit, Diablo 2 Lord of Destruction, which becomes this huge phenomena. People often credit Diablo 2 as revolutionizing the franchise, even though it was started by Diablo. The original one, Diablo 2, had a much bigger following. So Blizzard decides to release a remastered version of it. Remastered means just same game but improved graphics. Okay, so because Diablo 2 was released around 2000, I can't remember, it's 2000 or 2001. Diablo 2 Lord of Destruction, a couple years, maybe a year or two later. I can't remember the exact dates, but you're looking at like early 2000s. Whereas the remastered is released, we're talking like recently, right? Like just modern times, right? So they're working on the remastered version, and theoretically it's just improving the graphics. But what happened was there was some of the artwork was actually changed. Okay, so it wasn't just improving the existing art, but actually changing some of the art. That upset a lot of people, and some of the art that was changed had to do with clothing of female characters, beauty-related facial features of female characters. That created a lot of controversy. People felt that there was like a political censorship going on. And at the same time, now the fan base is even more older, right? So even more critical, even more difficult to impress. So you also expect rankings to drop because of that. And it is a remaster, which means it's not a new game. It's something that's already been done, and so it doesn't have that new and fresh feel to it, and so that's of course going to lower scores as well. And we see a big drop in terms of audience ranking, right? 3.7 out of 10. And the critics also rank it a bit lower. They rank it as 80 rather than high 80s, which seems like not a big difference, but considering that critics are ranking all of these games between 76 and 94, if that's the range that you're looking at, well, then the difference between 80 and high 80s, it's a pretty big difference. And of course, we're ignoring Diablo Immortal because that's kind of what the franchise sort of does. So that's D2R, Diablo 2 Resurrected, as it's called. And then Diablo 4 is released. The whole reason we're making this video. And Diablo 4, in terms of customization of characters, it's somewhere between Diablo 3 and Diablo 2. So there is customization of characters that has returned in Diablo 4. So there are unique skills available to each class. You can choose how many points you put into what skill you put points into at all. So two players can play the same class and have a very different play experience. Now, because the game was released recently, people are still exploring different combinations of what abilities to use to see how different they in fact are. But it looks like, yeah, you can develop the same class to be specializing in different abilities and have a different play experience. That said, you don't get to change the parameters in the equations directly like you did in Diablo and Diablo 2. Okay, so which was called character attributes. You don't get to change that as directly. So it's somewhere in between the original two releases of Diablo and Diablo 3. So there is some customization, right? So that is an improvement. Okay. Now, the artwork is more of like the dark, non-cartoonish artwork as well. Not exactly like the first two Diablos, although it's difficult to compare because the graphics technology has really changed. Music is something people comment on. The music of Diablo 4, people tend to like it. The music of the original Diablo was also very memorable. So there's that aspect to it as well. Now, there's also the age factor. Okay, so again, Diablo 4 is released. The fan base is older than they were when Diablo 3 was released. They are more difficult to impress. They are harsher critics. And despite being more difficult to impress, they give Diablo 4 a 5 out of 10. Okay, so they gave it roughly the same score that Diablo 3 got. Now that's noteworthy. Okay, because you just look at these dots and you think, oh, same score. Looks like it's the audience view it as the same quality game. But keep in mind that the audience ranking Diablo 4 are older than the audience ranking Diablo 3. They are harsher critics. They are more difficult to impress. Even though they're the same individuals, they're the same individuals years later. So they are giving it the same score as something that was ranked by audience that are more easily impressed. What that tells you is that if there is such thing as an objective ranking of how good a work of art is, or a game is, and I think there is such thing as an objective quality, then that tells you it's objectively better. right? If harsher critics, if people more difficult to impress, give it the same score, well, then that would suggest that if you control for how easy it is to impress someone, then the score would be higher. And that's what a lot of people kind of, if you just talk about them, they'll say that, oh, Diablo 4 is better than Diablo 3, but not the same as the first two releases, right? Or people will say like, oh yeah, I can tell it's a good game, but you know, I'm just not as into it as I was before. And of course, again, right, older, harder to impress, less time on their hands, they're going to be much more picky with what kind of entertainment they spend their time on. So that's interesting. Another thing to note, an issue that existed with Diablo 3 is that you had different classes that actually seemed to play very similar. For example, you had like a hunter class that does ranged attacks with a bow, and you have a wizard class that does ranged attacks with magic. Well, they're both ranged fighters. The play experience is similar. It's just, you know, the visual is different. Arrows shooting versus, you know, fire shooting. So there were some complaints about that. Whether that's the case with Diablo 4 or not, well, we have yet to see, because again, the game was recently released. Right now it looks like I said, it's being ranked roughly the same by critics and audiences. Now what's interesting is critics, that's an industry. These are professionals, okay? And the age factor is probably not as significant for critics as it is for audience. Okay, video game critics, were they teenager-ish when the first two Diablos were released? Probably not, right? They were probably young adults when the original two were released, and they were young adults when 3 and 4 were released, right? So the age distribution of critics is probably pretty similar, and critics are ranking, you know, Diablo 2, 3, and 4 pretty similar, okay? And whereas the audience, I think there's a significant age difference in the average Diablo player for the first two, and then 3, and then 4. They are gradually getting older, so that age factor comes into play. So we have some interesting phenomena there, right? We have some evidence about the intellectual property versus people working on it comparison. We have some interesting age comparisons, right? Like the same ranking by different age groups might suggest that if you had the same age group ranking the two products, then one would be higher than the other. So I thought that's some interesting data, and maybe we'll do a follow-up if reviews of Diablo 4 drastically change as people get to know the game better. So I hope you enjoyed that, and until next time.